It's exactly 3 months yesterday that I gave the speech, what's now known as the Newcastle speech, Her Rights at Work, the Political Persecution of Australia's First Female Prime Minister, in which I documented in excruciating detail the ways in which Julia Gillard, Australia's first female Prime Minister, has been vilified and denigrated by the federal opposition, by the media and by many ordinary citizens. Much of this abuse has been via email and social media. Much of the vilification has been sexual in nature. It has taken the form of crude drawings, crude cartoons of her, for example, wearing a huge strap-on dildo, or photoshopped images of her face over an obscenely fat, naked body. Some of it has been violent. One image that is still circulating calls for her to be shot on sight. There are words used about the Prime Minister that would never, could never, be used about a man in the same job. There is an entire vocabulary of words that describe and demean women. Bitch, barren, childless, hag, slut, witch, cow, menopausal monster. All of these words have been used recently in reference to Julia Gillard. All of this is demeaning. All of it seeks to undermine her authority as Prime Minister. These crude attacks are an assault on her legitimacy. Because they rely on sexual and other gender-specific attacks for their potency, I have branded this campaign of vilification misogynist. Since I posted that speech on my website on the 5th of September, more than 100,000 people have visited to read it. If you're not one of them, I suggest you visit annesummers.com.au and catch up with it. But what I want to talk about today is the reaction to that speech and to draw some conclusions from those reactions. Many hundreds of people left comments on my website after reading the speech, and there were two common responses. A lot of people, both men and women, told me they cried. They were overcome with shame at what was being done to our Prime Minister. I think they were also having a very natural and a very visceral reaction to the overwhelming evidence of misogyny. It is not pleasant to confront hatred. It is horrible to have to recognise that we women are still the targets of such feelings and attitudes. And I remember how confronting I found it many, many years ago, probably before most of you younger women in this room were even born, when I first read Germaine Greer's book, The Female Eunuch, and in that book there is a line that says, most women have no idea how much men hate them. And I recoiled from that because I didn't want to think that that could possibly be true. And so it's horrible when we have to confront these attitudes, and it is, quite frankly, frightening. The second reaction from people was that they said they were glad that I'd put into words and documented what they themselves had been noticing. Everyone was noticing that the Prime Minister is not even accorded the respect of being addressed by her last name. This is especially the case in the media. I just want to show you the Australian newspaper from Tuesday this week, when the AWU matter, of course, was all over the headlines. So it says, Gillard rounds on ABC. Down here, Julia clears the air as best she can. And the very same paper, on the very same day, their middle section, their A+ section, says, Julia's first duty of care. Now, I would challenge anyone to find me a newspaper article that said Kevin's first duty of care, or John's first duty of care, or Paul's first duty of care, or Bob's first duty of care. None of our previous Prime Ministers have been subject to this disrespect. But what other people said to me was that they were shocked by what I'd presented. They had no idea how bad it was. And those of you who have seen the speech, read the speech, will know that I've presented two versions of it on my website. One is the vanilla version, in which all of the really horrible images have been taken out. And then there's the R-rated version, which is the one that most people have downloaded, which includes the images which are shocking, which are confronting, but which I argue we need to see, we need to know what's happened. And I have to say that when I started the research, I had no idea either how bad it was. When I started that research, I was still thinking things like ditch the witch and Bob Brown's bitch were as bad as it got. Little did I know just how sexual and violent and scary this stuff was. It was enough to make you cry, with shame, with anger, and with despair. 6 weeks later, on the 9th of October, Julia Gillard surprised us all with her now famous sexism and misogyny speech to Federal Parliament. The speech went viral and global and attracted praise from all quarters, including from President Barack Obama, for the way she denounced the sexism and misogyny of the Leader of the Opposition. I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man. I will not. Not now, not ever, she said. And I was fortunate enough to be invited to Christmas drinks at Kirribilli House last night, and the Prime Minister, in speaking with the gathering there, mentioned what her wishes were for the new year, and her number one wish was that her YouTube video of this speech would, it's already been viewed by more than 2 million people, but she wants it to get the same number of hits as the Korean dancer Psy with his. So that's her New Year's wish. In making this speech and in remarks since, Prime Minister Gillard has put sexism and misogyny clearly on the national agenda. As she said just this week, I just want to quote her, she said, "I think it is actually a manifestation of deep sexism that you would say that if a woman raises her voice, then that is her playing the victim, as opposed to her standing up for her rights." This has been empowering for her and for women everywhere. We can stand proud. We can say we will not be lectured to or harassed or treated disrespectfully because we are women. The game has changed. Maybe it is a surprise that misogyny is still so pervasive. We thought things had changed after all these years, after all these victories for equality. We've now got girls doing well in education. Women are now more than a quarter of the country's politicians. There are women on the High Court, women umpiring at the AFL, women strappers at the VRC, CEO of a major bank is a woman, so on and so on. We've got our first woman Prime Minister. This should have been proof that misogyny no longer existed. Instead, it has become proof that it is alive and thriving. That's why the Prime Minister's speech resonated so. And it's why my documenting of what is being done to her had such an impact. Women everywhere thought two things. Firstly, it's now okay to talk about this stuff, to say that it's happened to me. I'm not a victim anymore. Secondly, women said, well, God, if it's happening to her, what's it like for women with no power? What's it like for the low-paid women who desperately need their jobs? For those who don't speak English and are vulnerable to exploitation? Now, we know that there are partners, female partners in large firms who get sexually harassed by their male colleagues. We know male CEOs of large department store organisations who've harassed their staff. And we know now that the Prime Minister of this country has been harassed, including sexually harassed, by large numbers of her constituents. Truly shameful. Now, sexual harassment may be an extreme manifestation of misogyny. It's blatant. It's a way of putting women in their place. And I like to think back to those women pioneers in the 1970s, and I remember these days, and these women who went into previously male-dominated occupations, such as the police force, the fire department, the steelworks. And what used to happen with them is that often that they'd go to their lockers, they'd open them up, and there'd be photographs torn out of magazines of naked women there. This was an unambiguous expression of hostility from their male co-workers. This was saying, we don't want you here, girlie. This was saying women are only good for one thing. And that is what people are saying to our Prime Minister when they post these sexually explicit images. How must she feel when she logs onto her computer and sees such things? The same as those women back in the 1970s when they opened up their lockers and saw those photographs of naked women. Today we need to look at the everyday manifestations of sexism and misogyny as well as these really blatant examples. We need to look at the banal examples, and those of you who are on Twitter, you know the hashtag everyday sexism. These examples are things that happen day after day that really get you down. But also, we need to consider this. Why, 40 years after equal pay was legislated in this country, do women still receive, on average, only 82 cents for every dollar earned by men? Why will a 25-year-old woman entering the workforce today have lifetime earnings of $1 million less than a man with equivalent education and skills? Why does the earnings gap increase with education? Why will a 25-year-old woman with a postgraduate degree entering the workforce this year earn $1.3 million less than a 25-year-old man with equivalent education? Why are there so few women leading our companies? Last week, the biennial census of women in leadership positions in Australian companies was released by the Equal Opportunities for Women in Workplace Agency, EOWA. The key result of that census was, and I quote, "A decade of negligible change for females in executive ranks." A decade of negligible change for women in executive ranks. Women make up only 9.2% of executives in Australia's top 500 companies. The boys' club is still well and truly alive in Australian business. Now, what's this got to do with misogyny, you might ask? Well, I think it's time we started to understand that excluding women from any area of society, business, the church, the military, anywhere, is an expression of hostility. And we need to also remember that even when we are there in certain places, that we're often treated with extreme disrespect. And I like to give the example of there are women who work in certain jobs, particularly in the finance industry, where they are, and we saw that woman from Goldman Sachs before from the American TEDx, where women are in an extreme minority, and they are often, for example, asked to join in with what the boys do at lunchtime. And what the boys do at lunchtime is go to gentlemen's clubs and watch pole dances. And so they'll say to their female colleague, "Okay, come along." And she'll say, if she doesn't come, she's a prude, she's not a good sport. If she does go, she's going to feel uncomfortable and humiliated, standing there or sitting there, having a few drinks, watching another woman half naked, lap dancing or pole dancing for the edification of her colleagues. So this is an example of, you're damned if you do and doomed if you don't. It's exactly 40 years in December, today, since 1972, when Gough Whitlam, the Prime Minister at the time, put equality of the sexes on the national agenda. Ever since then, we Australians have supposedly been working towards that goal of equality of the sexes. We have legislated to end discrimination. We have put in remedies against unfair treatment. We have encouraged girls to pursue high levels of education. We've seen many barriers broken as women enter professions or jobs previously only occupied by men. But, as we have seen with the election of our first female Prime Minister, breaking these barriers has not been enough. We have made progress, of course we have, but is that enough? And I would like to tell you what the US Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, has to say about the notion of progress. She was speaking at an APEC Women in the Economy Summit in San Francisco last September, and she was pointing out the huge contribution that women's employment in developed countries has made to global economic growth. And she in fact quoted The Economist magazine, which says that the contribution made by women to the economy in developed countries to global growth is in fact greater than that made by China. But then she said, and I quote, "If women are already making such contributions to economic growth, why do we need a major realignment in our thinking, our markets, our policies? Why do we need to issue a declaration from this summit?" Well, because evidence of progress is not evidence of success. Evidence of progress is not evidence of success, and that, I believe, is a truly revolutionary insight. For the past 40 years, we have looked at progress. We have measured and counted and tallied, and in doing so, thought we were making headway. We did not look at success. Perhaps we assumed the two things were synonymous. It turns out that they are not. We have no greater proof of this than the treatment of our first female Prime Minister. you would think there would be no more spectacular example of our progress towards equality than having a woman Prime Minister. Instead, having a woman in this job has unleashed a veritable avalanche of hostility towards her as a woman, an avalanche of misogyny. That is the same attitude that is denying women an equal place in the executive suites of our large companies. It's the same attitude that's denying women of equal education and skills the same lifetime earnings. This is the same attitude that says that women can be equal, whatever that means, given what I've just outlined, but we can't have real power. Just last Monday night in Sydney, there was a dinner. The Australian Hotels Association had their annual dinner, and the comedian that they had to provide the entertainment, his entertainment consisted of making a series of sexist and racist jokes about our Prime Minister and our Finance Minister. Was there a whimper of protest from the men in the room? Of course there wasn't. So let's stop fretting about our progress towards equality and let's start looking at barriers to success and what success will look like. In my way of looking at it, success will be true equality, not as measured by how many women do what jobs, but by the acceptance and respect for women wherever we are. We are lucky, I think, that we have a Prime Minister who has decided to take up the fight. She is not dodging responsibility to other women that comes from being the first woman to do that job. She is not cowed when the Leader of the Opposition says, as he did in Parliament on Thursday, this is not about gender, this is about character. It's totally about gender. It is about the sexism and misogyny that pervade our culture, that affect every woman from the Prime Minister down, and which we have finally decided has got to stop. We are now destroying the joint. We are destroying that old sexist, misogynist joint that would not let us in, or where it did, that treats us with such disrespect and contempt that denies us legitimacy. We have called it, the Prime Minister has called it for what it is, sexism and misogyny, and now we're going to end it. And I just want to finish by telling you a story about another reaction to my speech, my Newcastle speech. At the end of that speech, those of you who've read it will know that I call on people to say, it stops with me. And I say to people, if you see one of these emails or one of these horrible messages on Facebook or one of these hideous images, don't share it, don't retweet it, don't pass it on the chain email. Confront the person who sent it to you, send it back and say, it stops with me. Now, in the X-rated appendix to my speech, which is on the website, which it contains the really, truly disgusting stuff that you have a very strong stomach to want to have a look at, included in that is a very historic photograph of Quentin Bryce, our first female Governor-General, and Julia Gillard, our first female Prime Minister, on the day that Quentin Bryce swore in Julia Gillard. Wonderful photo, I'm sure you remember it. It was on the front of all the papers. That photograph has been placed on a Facebook page called Julia Gillard is the worst Prime Minister in Australia's history, and people were invited to make comments about the photograph. And there were many, many hundreds of comments listed under this photograph by people on Facebook, all of them making pretty disgusting suggestions about what these two women should be doing with each other, preferably in the bedroom. Now, as a result of my speech, and I'd written and looked at this last week, and I must admit it brought me to tears to look at it, dozens and dozens of people have now gone to that site, gone to that picture, and underneath they have written, it stops with me. And that's the message I want to take from today. It stops with me. Thank you.